Welcome to Heartbreak Chronicles. Ethan sat in his study with a cell phone in his hand. It wasn't his phone, but a brand new black iPhone, purchased 3 days ago. At that moment, the screen displayed a photo. The lobby of a well-decorated hotel. His wife Isabelle was walking out of the elevator, surrounded by a man in a suit, their hands touching inadvertently. It was the eighth similar photo in his collection. He took a deep breath, put the phone in a drawer, and turned to face the computer screen. On it was an Excel spreadsheet of anomalies over the past 6 months, a yoga class Isabelle claimed to be attending at a time that didn't fit her schedule, an inexplicable additional purchase at a team-building restaurant, late-night text messages about working late. All of this is documented in an organized manner, as precisely and calmly as he usually handles electrical engineering projects. Ethan first noticed something unusual 3 months ago when Isabelle came home with an unfamiliar scent of cologne on her collar. At the time, he'd only frowned, not seethed. After all, 15 years of marriage had taught him that there were some things that needed to wait for the right moment. So he waited, watched, and gathered. And today, he finally identified the man Marcus Wilson, an account representative for Isabelle, married with 2 children. Ethan shut down his computer and stood in front of the window looking out at the gloomy Seattle night sky. He felt no anger, only a strange calm. It was as if, faced with a long-ago doomed ending, he just needed to decide how to bow out gracefully, or how to give the betrayer a taste of his own medicine. When Isabelle pushed open the bedroom door, her face wore a well-rehearsed mixture of exhaustion and determination. She didn't look at Ethan, who was sitting on the edge of the bed, slowly lacing up his work boots, but simply cast her gaze out the window at the overcast Seattle sky. Her voice not loud, but like a stone thrown into the surface of a calm lake, with premeditated ripples. Ethan, I've had enough. This marriage, I really can't last any longer. Ethan's hand paused, but only for a moment. He didn't even look up, just let out a soft laugh that seemed a little abrupt in the cool morning air, even with a hint of pleasure. He tightened the last of his shoelaces and stood up, patting the dust from his pants before turning to Isabelle, an almost gentle calm on his face that she had never seen before. Oh, he raised an eyebrow, his tone so relaxed it sounded like he was discussing what to have for dinner. Just what I wanted. Isabelle's load of accusations, grievances, and the whole losing yourself and ineffective communication thing stuck in her throat. She expected arguments, pleas, angry questions, and even a hysterical outburst, but not such a light, relieving agreement. She froze there, like a supporting character who is halfway through a play and the protagonist throws away the script and improvises, momentarily at a loss as to how to continue. What did you say? Isabelle's voice held an imperceptible tremor as she tried to find a hint of camouflage in Ethan's brown eyes, which always seemed too stoic, a hint of the hurt or anger she knew so well, hidden beneath the silence. But there was nothing there but a clear, almost indifferent calm. Just what I need, I'd say. Ethan repeated, this time looking straight at her, a hint of a smile even playing at the corners of his mouth. I thought you'd never say it. He crossed over to her and headed for the closet and began pulling out his work clothes and backpack, moving fluidly and naturally, as if it were just another ordinary Wednesday morning, not the moment their 15-year marriage came to an end. Isabelle felt a wave of vertigo. This wasn't right. The drama wasn't supposed to be like this. She was the one who, after much deliberation, had summoned the courage to propose a separation. She should be the one in control, the one watching the other fall apart with a hint of pity. But now, Ethan's reaction made her feel like a clown who had just put on a one-woman show that no one was applauding. She forced herself to calm down and tried to take back the reins. Ethan, this isn't a joke. I'm serious. We have a problem. I know. Ethan interrupts her as he pulls a canvas backpack from the closet that looks a little old and starts stuffing things into it. I know there's a problem between us, Isabelle. It's more clear than you think. Isabelle frowned as a sense of foreboding crept over her. What do you mean? Ethan stopped moving his hands and turned around, leaning against the closet door. Instead of avoiding her gaze as he usually did, he met it openly. It means that you think you're hiding it well, but you're actually broken. His voice was still calm, but it was like a cold, dissecting knife, precisely cutting through Isabelle's carefully maintained appearances. For example, You said you were going to an experiential class at a newly opened yoga studio, but your cell phone's location showed you near that expensive boutique hotel on the west side of the city for 3 consecutive Tuesdays. For example, the lingering, unfamiliar smell of cologne in your car is definitely not a brand that your balding boss at the office would wear. Another example, the fancy restaurant bills that never show up in our lives on our joint credit card. The memo is always team building dinner, but your team members, two of whom I happen to have worked with last week fixing circuits, say that they're so busy these days that they're only able to fix lunch at the office. Isabelle's face whitened with each one of Ethan's statements. It was like she'd been stripped naked and thrown out into the cold. All those lies and excuses she'd thought were so seamless seemed so clumsy and ridiculous at the moment in Ethan's calm narrative. She opened her mouth to argue, but found her throat too dry to make any sound. It turned out that he wasn't slow, he wasn't unconcerned, he was just picking up and filing away each of her betrayals, like a patient collector in silence, and then waiting for a moment like this. And Ethan's gaze fell on the brand new bracelet on her wrist that she'd lied about picking up during the sale season. From Marcus? Good taste, much better than that last necklace. The name Marcus exploded in Isabelle's ears like a thunderbolt. She took a sharp step back, the blood draining from her face. He knew everything. That secret world of passion and freshness that she had so carefully maintained had long been exposed to him, right under his nose. Ethan watched her panic, his face devoid of any victor's triumph, only an almost weary resignation. He zipped up his backpack and retraced his steps to the door. So, Isabelle, you say you've had enough and want a divorce. I agree, 100%. Where are the papers? Are they ready? If not, I can have my lawyer draw them up as soon as possible. Isabelle went cold, feeling like everything she had so carefully planned was now falling apart in a way she couldn't control. She had envisioned a goodbye full of moral superiority, accounting of Ethan's faults, his busy schedule, his lack of interest, his lack of understanding of her inner world, and then a graceful turn away as a victim. But now, she became that naked betrayer, deprived of even the last bit of decency. I've gotten a lawyer. Her voice was as thin as a fly. The papers are on the table downstairs. Good. Ethan nodded, his tone even taking on a hint of approval. Very efficient. He walked to the door, his hand on the knob, and looked back at her one last time. A look that was complicated and difficult to understand, a mixture of disappointment and relief, but not a hint of lingering. I'll move out as soon as I can. Leave the house to you. I'll just take what belongs to me. The door closed softly, isolating Isabelle from all reaction. She sat paralyzed on the bed, cold fear and humiliation overwhelming her like a tidal wave. She'd lost the moment she'd announced that the game had begun. Ethan walked into the study and locked the door. Inside the room, a thick rug absorbed all the sound. He knelt in the center of the carpet and rattled open a piece of a hidden door behind the closet. It was a hidden space he'd designed during the renovations 3 years ago. Inside was his contingency plan, a laptop, a safe full of cash, an unregistered cell phone, and all the evidence he had collected over the past few months. He'd known this day was coming from the day he'd bumped into Isabelle in the hotel lobby. He was installing a professional lighting system for a client when he looked up and saw her and Marcus walking out of the elevator, and the moment their eyes met told him everything. But Ethan chose to remain silent. Not to not care, but to choose to respond in his own way. He began investigating, documenting, plotting. Every time Isabelle lied, he recorded it. Every time she came home late at night under the pretext of working late, he silently tracked it down and verified it. Every piece of evidence that could be favorable to the divorce lawsuit, he discreetly kept. Ethan knew that anger and impulsiveness would only put him at a disadvantage when dealing with someone like Isabelle. What he needed was a calm, precise counterattack. For the next few days, he would use silence as his sharpest weapon to make her experience what it felt like to be completely erased. He pulled out the spare cell phone and saw that it showed an unread text from Clara. Are you okay? Feel free to chat anytime. Clara Prescott, his friend from college and the only person he trusted to confide in after learning about Isabelle's cheating. If there was any regret in the marriage, it was that he hadn't recognized Isabelle for who she was when he'd chosen a woman as down-to-earth and sincere as Clara. Ethan took a deep breath and replied, "Things have moved on. She filed for divorce today." Clara replied almost immediately. "And your reaction?" "Proceeded as planned. Totally accepted. No arguments." Ethan typed a reply. "She's totally devastated." "Careful, Ethan. Revenge is sweet, but don't let it consume you." Ethan stared at the message, a slight tremor somewhere in his heart. Clara was always like this, never forgetting to care about his heart, even when he was planning to fight back. It reminded him of his college days, the way Isabelle and the group of friends had been tough and calm when they teased Clara. Clara had never been weak. She'd just chosen a different way to fight. "I'm sober," he replied. "It's not just revenge, it's also relief." The next few days were an unspeakable ordeal for Isabelle, and Ethan did what he said he would do. His removal was swift and complete, with an almost surgical precision and indifference. He didn't argue. He didn't delay. He didn't even show any negative emotions. Every day, Isabelle came home from work to find the house empty again. It wasn't the expensive furniture or the artwork they'd acquired together that he'd taken with him, but the things that really bore his mark. Gone from the bookshelves were his specialized books on electrical engineering and vintage radios. Gone from the garage were the toolboxes he'd used for years and the parts he'd left behind from his tinkering. Gone were the clothes in the closet that had belonged to him, along with the familiar faint smell of motor oil mixed with soap pods. Even his usual mug in the kitchen, with its tiny chip, had disappeared. He left behind the antique mirror that Isabelle claimed represented their taste, the hardcover books she bought but never looked through, and the Le Creuset pots and pans they received when they were married and used only twice. But he took with him the handwritten card that Isabelle had slipped into his briefcase when he wasn't looking on their third anniversary. Her eyes hadn't yet begun to chase other people's reflections, and Ethan had kept it, Isabelle thought, not out of affection, but as a collection of evidence that might be useful in the future. Ethan's disappearance had gone more smoothly than he had expected. He had been preparing for this moment for nearly 6 months, from the moment he discovered Isabelle's first lie. He rented a temporary apartment that was simple enough, yet tasteful enough. Those items he truly cherished, the toolbox, the professional books, the collection of old records, were carefully transferred here. Each one is carefully selected, taking with it only those things that are truly his, those that do not evoke any memories of Isabelle. At the same time, Ethan has implemented his digital disappearance program. He canceled most of his social media accounts, changed his cell phone number, and redirected all of his emails to a brand new mailbox. He even spent a full day downloading and backing up his and Isabelle's shared cloud albums, then completely deleted the original accounts. Each step was precise and calm, just as he handled the electrical circuits at work, cutting one wire and connecting another, exactly according to the predetermined drawings, without any emotional fluctuations. The most complicated part was the financial separation. Fortunately, as a man accustomed to planning, Ethan had long maintained a partially separate financial system. Now he just had to activate the already prepared Plan B, transferring his funds to the newly opened account, while making sure to leave Isabelle with enough joint assets to avoid any possible legal disputes. He didn't want anything that would keep them entangled. Throughout the process, Ethan was surprised at how calm he was. There was no hysterical anger, no breaking down into tears, and even a hint of hatred was well controlled. The sting of betrayal had been transformed into a calmer, stronger determination to remove himself from the relationship and to give Isabelle a taste of what it would be like to be given up. Isabelle was not at home when he took out the last box. This was carefully arranged to avoid any time she might be home. He left a note on the dining room table with a single line that read, "Signed papers have been given to the attorney." No goodbyes, no explanations, not even a take care. Just like that, Ethan Alden disappeared from Isabelle's life, both physically and psychologically. In the process, only Clara knew his true feelings and plans. Every evening, after he had finished organizing the items he needed to take care of for the day, he would give Clara a brief phone call to tell her about the progress and listen to her talk about lighthearted daily chores. These conversations became his mental anchor, keeping him from completely hardening his heart as he carried out this icy plan. Clara never criticized his choices or encouraged him to go to extremes. She just supported him in a calm but firm way, giving him a space where he could take off his disguise. With Clara, Ethan doesn't have to pretend to be the one who doesn't care. He can admit his pain and get back on his feet. This kind of support is not so much love as it is a deep understanding and respect. Clara knows what he needs and respects the way he deals with it. And that's exactly what Isabelle never gave him. As the house empties day by day, Isabelle's heart sinks a little, and Ethan's silence suffocates her more than any heated argument. The tug of war over the division of property, the drama of blaming each other that she had expected, none of it happened. He just, quietly and efficiently, peeled himself out of her life like pulling out a cavity, moving quickly and leaving nothing to chance. She tried to reach him via text message to discuss the details of the divorce, or just to break the uneasy silence. Ethan, regarding property division, I think we should. The message was read and not replied to. Shouldn't we standardize what we say with our friends? Lest everyone. Message read, no reply. Ethan, what the hell do you want? Message read, still no reply. This utter ignorance hurts more than an angry rant. It sends a clear and brutal message. You, and everything you say, means nothing to me anymore. A week later, Ethan moved out completely. There were no goodbyes, no messages, not even an email filled with resentment. The house was awfully quiet, with only Isabelle's own footsteps echoing through the empty rooms. She stood in the center of the living room that had once been filled with the sin of their lives, and for the first time, she felt a bone-chilling cold and panic. She'd always thought it was because she was tired of the lackluster marriage that she wanted to break free. But it wasn't until this moment, watching Ethan leave so decisively and calmly, that she vaguely realized that perhaps it had never been her who had let go first. She needs an audience, someone to validate her victim status. So on the first weekend after Ethan moved out, she gathered her girlfriends, Amanda, a perennially divorced woman with a penchant for wine, Kelly, who couldn't keep a secret from her, and Heather, her oldest friend and perhaps the only one who remembers what she looked like before she had plastic surgery. They were meeting at the downtown diner known for its overpriced beet salads and faux rustic style. Isabelle, wearing oversized sunglasses big enough to cover half her face and placing her designer handbags on the table like shields, spoke in an appropriately tremulous tone. He didn't even try to save our marriage. 15 years, Amanda, 15 years. He just laughed, signed, and left. Amanda covered her chest exaggeratedly, as if she had heard some terrible news. Are you serious? He didn't say anything. Isabelle shook her head slowly, playing the melodrama to the hilt. Not a word. Didn't even ask why. It's like I'm just a stranger who doesn't matter. Kelly immediately went into overdrive with righteous indignation. That's a sociopathic personality. Isabelle, he's so cold-blooded. Who does that? Only Heather, silent as ever, just stirring the melting ice in her glass with a straw, her eyes a little sharper than usual, had always felt that Heather's seemingly neutral exterior hid a clear head. At the moment, from the slight tilt of Heather's head and her scrutinizing gaze, Isabelle sensed that she might have smelled something not quite right behind this melodrama. Because the crux of the matter was that the sympathy Isabelle was expecting wasn't coming as expected. When a jilted man doesn't cry, doesn't beg, doesn't put on any intense drama, but disappears as calmly as morning mist meets sunlight, people's curiosity will be aroused. Whispers will start to spread. Maybe it's not that simple. Maybe there's something else going on. Isabelle tries to steer the conversation towards Ethan's indifference, but she senses that the atmosphere has already changed. Her sad narrative paled in comparison to Ethan's unusually calm exit. For the first time, she realized that a one-woman show without the cooperation of an opponent was so difficult to sustain. Meanwhile, Ethan had started a whole new life. He didn't post anything on social media about new life or freedom. He didn't announce his divorce to the world. He just quietly devoted himself to his work. He changed his cell phone number, canceled most of his social media accounts, and transferred all his emails to an anonymous private email address. The utility bills were silently transferred to Isabelle's name. Even his usual music streaming account was desynchronized from his home stereo. Like a skilled hacker, he erased himself pixel by pixel from the digital picture of their life together. This complete disappearance was more disturbing to Isabelle than the divorce itself. The heartbreak, the anger, the drunken texts at 2 a.m., or the phone calls to friends crying for peace that she had expected didn't happen. What she got was nothingness. And that nothingness, that utter quiet, was a strength in itself. It's less like peace and more like a silent mastery. It begins to eat away at Isabelle's self-confidence, making her begin to wonder if her decision to get divorced in the first place was really that wise. She began to lose sleep, tossing and turning in her large, empty bed. Every object in the house seems to be a silent reminder of Ethan's presence and absence. She couldn't help but go through the pictures of their past. The everyday routines that she once saw as bland and boring seemed so precious at the moment. She begins to frantically wonder where Ethan is now, what he's doing, how he's doing. She tried to contact Ethan's mother, which was her last resort, as she had never had a good relationship with the former mother-in-law. When the call came through, the older woman's voice was as cold as ever. "Ethan? Oh, he's fine." The old lady's tone was unruffled. "He's been busy with a big project he recently took on. Changed to a new place to live. The environment is good. The view is wide open." Did he say anything about US? Isabelle asked cautiously. A barely audible sneer came from the other end of the line. "Isabelle, all he said was that he was finally free. And also said, some people, you always have to wait until you lose them before you know how to cherish them. Unfortunately, not everyone has the chance to regret it." The old lady paused and added, "Oh yeah, he also said for you to enjoy team building with that Marcus guy." The phone was hung up, and Isabelle's hands and feet went cold as she gripped the microphone. Ethan's counterattack wasn't a storm of words, but rather this dense and precise statement of fact that left her speechless. He didn't show up in person, but through his mother's mouth, he clearly conveyed his attitude. He knew everything. He didn't care, and he was doing fine. Isabelle feels like she's trapped in an invisible cage. She used to be the one in control of the chess game, used to guiding public opinion and molding her own image. But now, another key piece on the board has simply dropped out of the game, bringing all her strategies to naught. She tries to play the victim, only to find that the audience begins to doubt her script. She longs for conflict, but all she gets is a maddening silence. This silence, like a vine, begins to wrap itself around her thoughts, causing her to chew over the truths that Ethan so calmly reveals in the dead of night. She began to ask herself, were her feelings for Marcus really love? Or was it just an escape from the humdrum of marriage and the emptiness of her own heart? Is the so-called passion and ego she pursues just an excuse for selfishness? The third week after Ethan moves out, Isabelle receives divorce papers from her attorney detailing the division of their joint assets. To her surprise, Ethan made a much fairer offer than she expected. The house and most of the furniture were left to her, and he only wanted his work tools and some savings. There was no hard feelings, no badgering, and even the division of property seemed overly generous. This makes Isabelle more and more uneasy. A betrayed husband shouldn't react like this. Instinctively, she sensed that there had to be something behind it that she wasn't seeing. What is he playing at? She questioned the agreement in her hand as if it could give her the answer. A frightening thought came to mind. Perhaps Ethan simply didn't care anymore. Not pretending to care, but really, utterly no longer caring that she existed. The thought hurt more than any harsh insult. There was no answer. There was only the empty room and the never-ending, humid silence of Seattle outside the window. For the first time, she felt that this divorce, which she had initiated, might ultimately besiege her. Time passed in an uneasy calm as Isabelle tried to regain control of her life, frequenting the gym, updating her social media feeds, and attending parties and get-togethers in an effort to create the illusion that she was living life to the fullest after the divorce. But only she knew the emptiness and anxiety underneath that forced smile, and Ethan's complete disappearance was like an invisible thorn in her heart, causing a hidden pain. She couldn't stop imagining his life now, a life without her, whether it was really as free and wide open as his mother had said. The turnaround, or rather, the deeper blow, came from Heather, who was still at the familiar restaurant on a lazy Saturday afternoon, Isabelle absent-mindedly poking at the kale salad on her plate, the Chardonnay in front of her already bottomed out, and Heather absently stirring the ice in her glass as if suddenly remembering something, casually saying, "Oh, yeah, That's right. Said, "Oh yeah, I think I saw Ethan last week." Isabel's fork stopped in midair. Her heart skipped a beat. Where? She tried to make her voice sound less eager. Heather shrugged, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were scrutinizing her memory. At that new French restaurant on Bellevue Lake called Le Miroir. It's a nice setting, you know, the kind of place where you need to make reservations a month in advance, and even the napkins have to be fastened with silver rings. Isabelle snorted subconsciously. No way. Ethan hates places like that. He thinks any restaurant with a sommelier is a ripoff. Yeah, I think so too. Heather's eyes sharpened with a hint of probing. That's why I looked more closely. But it really was him, wearing an ironed black shirt and a new watch, looking, well, in good spirits. Better than I've ever seen him before, to be honest. Isabelle tried to squeeze out a smile, but the corners of her mouth twitched stiffly. He's alone. The question came out of her mouth with a nervousness she hadn't even noticed herself. Heather hesitated, and it was that brief pause that made Isabel's heart sink. The air seemed to freeze, the characteristic silence that preceded the learning of some unwanted truth. No, Heather's voice softened. He was with a woman. Isabelle jerked backward against the back of her chair, moving so fast that the wine in her glass shook out. Who? Who was the woman? Her voice became sharp and urgent. I don't recognize it. Heather shook her head, but it's striking. You know, the quiet but present type with a great demeanor. Long dark brown curly hair, wearing a minimally cut navy blue dress with pearl earrings. They were sitting in a corner booth in a card table, drinking wine and joking around. Joking. Isabelle repeats the word, her voice dry. Heather nodded, and as if to add credibility, added, and I saw the woman, quite naturally, put her hand on Ethan's wrist as he got up. It was like they were familiar and close. Isabel's lips pursed into a stiff, straight line. You must be looking at this the wrong way. Ethan's not that kind of. Her words seemed too pale to convince even herself. I'm not mistaken, Isabelle, Heather said as if she'd made up her mind of some sort, and she reached into her bag, fumbled around for a while, and pulled out not gum, but her cell phone. She unlocked the screen and gave it a few quick taps before turning the screen of her phone toward Isabelle, her tone apologetic, yet unusually firm. I didn't want to show you, but I thought that maybe you should know. Isabelle's eyes fell on the cell phone screen. It was a surreptitious photo, not very pixelated and somewhat dimly lit, but enough to see. The focal point of the photo was the side of Ethan's face, and he was smiling slightly, that relaxed, heartfelt smile that Isabelle couldn't remember seeing in many years. He was also sitting in a stretched position, shoulders relaxed, chin slightly raised, and his whole body exuded a sense of unprecedented ease and vigor. The woman sitting across from him had one hand gracefully resting on his wrist, and even in the blurred image, she could feel the aura of self-glowing radiance that she didn't need to deliberately curry favor with. Isabelle's expression doesn't change at first. She handed the phone back to Heather, moving with a restrained, detached grace she was used to when she was faking an orgasm. But Heather looked into her eyes, not her mouth. Isabelle's eyes, in that moment, flashed clearly with a flicker of panic and sting that she couldn't hide. He didn't even tell me he was seeing someone else. Isabelle murmured, unconsciously stirring her glass of white wine that had gotten warm. You're divorced, Isabelle, Heather reminded gently, her tone gentle but to the point. He didn't need to tell you. Isabelle didn't respond. She just stared blankly out the window, watching a couple holding their golden retriever, taking a leisurely stroll down the sidewalk, the image so harmonious that she felt a little prickly. Deep inside, something began to break. It wasn't pain, it wasn't sadness, it was a sourer, older emotion, an emotion she had denied and repressed for years, jealousy. She hated that feeling. Because in her script, Ethan was supposed to be the one who ebbed away and grew banal. He'd probably find some random boring woman, get out of shape, and start indulging in cheap beer and mowing the lawn. Instead, he'd be in and out of fancy restaurants, wearing expensive watches, accompanied by a woman who was so elegant and proper that she'd naturally touch his wrist. This was a complete departure from her expectations. For the first time, a horrible thought hit her so clearly. Maybe she'd never really known Ethan. Or worse, maybe she had, but had taken him for granted as a backdrop to the silence and dedication he gave day in and day out, never really seeing his value. She told herself it was just a temporary rebound for Ethan, some kind of compensata after the divorce, but the image of the navy blue dress and pearl earrings lingered in her mind like a ghost. Ethan's new life was going much smoother than he'd expected. The temporary apartment had been upgraded to a small but exquisite condominium on Bellevue Lake that had a great view, was quiet and cozy, and most importantly, was full of brand new possibilities. The first day he moved in, Ethan rearranged all the furniture in a completely different way than when he lived with Isabelle. Dark leather sofas replaced the beige fabric. Metal and wood replaced the deliberate sophistication of the past. Instead of abstract paintings, the walls were covered with old electrical drawings he had collected over the years, as well as certificates and awards he had received in engineering school, things that Isabelle had once dismissed as too technical and not classy enough and had put in the back of the house. Too technical and not tasteful, and put them in storage. The apartment, from floor to ceiling, was his choice. There is no compromise, no pandering to please others, only the purest self-expression. This sense of freedom allows him to wake up every morning with a new sense of anticipation and vigor. Meanwhile, his career is thriving. After his divorce, Ethan put all his energy into his work and took on several electrical system design projects for large commercial buildings. His professionalism and pragmatism soon won him recognition in the community, and the orders kept coming in. This professional success gave him more confidence and security. The only thing that made him feel a little worried was his relationship with Clara. Since Heather had seen them that day at the restaurant, they had both become more cautious. Not because of weakness, but because they don't want any gossip to taint the hard-won feelings. Clara Prescott, the girl who was ostracized and ridiculed by Isabelle in college, has grown into a successful architect. Her work is full of intelligence and grace, just like herself. She and Ethan re-encountered each other at an industry seminar. Ethan was giving a presentation on electrical systems for smart buildings, and Clara was sitting in the third row of the audience, notebook in hand, listening intently. After the presentation, she walked up and handed him a business card. "It's been a long time, Ethan." It was such a simple sentence, but it made the time seem to rewind back to 10 years ago, to the campus where they were both young and dreaming. By then, Ethan had already noticed Clara's intelligence and gentleness, but he had ended up choosing the shinier, more socially adept Isabelle, which in hindsight was probably one of the biggest bad decisions of his life. They began to see each other as friends, sharing their work and lives, and Clara never brought up Isabelle, even though she knew Ethan was married. She respected boundaries and kept just the right amount of distance. It wasn't until the day Ethan found out about Isabelle's relationship with Marcus during a chance meeting that he opened up to Clara for the first time about the truth of his marriage. Clara doesn't show the dramatic sympathy or anger that the others do. She just listened quietly and then said, "I support you in whatever decision you make. But remember, don't let other people's mistakes define you." It's those words that make Ethan realize that Clara is different. She wasn't encouraging him to retaliate or urging him to forgive. She just wanted whatever decision he made to be for himself, not against others. From then on, Clara became the only informed and moral support for Ethan's revenge plans. As he executes those steps with calm and precision, Clara provides invaluable female perspective and emotional advice to help him avoid slipping into blind rage and lingering bitterness. As the divorce process progressed, their relationship deepened. When Ethan officially moved out of the house he shared with Isabelle, it was Clara who helped him find the lakeside condo. When he began rearranging the furniture, it was Clara who offered suggestions that were both practical and tasteful. Their relationship develops naturally, with no deliberate pursuit or blind passion, just a gradual emotional growth in mutual understanding and appreciation. The growth was so healthy and real that Ethan sometimes wondered what his life would have been like if he'd seen Clara's value 10 years ago. "There's no use regretting it," Clara once told him in a late-night conversation. "Without those choices, none of us would be who we are now. I like the person you are now, Ethan, the one who's more confident and knows what he wants." Those words burned into Ethan's heart like a gentle seal. Yes, he was no longer the man who constantly compromised to maintain superficial harmony. Now he knew his worth and how to protect his heart. Clara, on the other hand, is the one who walks him through this path of transformation. Curiosity, or rather resignation, grows like a weed, and Isabelle finds herself uncontrollably following everything that could possibly be related to Ethan. She refreshed the social media pages of mutual friends that she had long since stopped contacting, trying to piece together what Ethan was up to from the clues. She even began driving through the upscale residential neighborhoods of Bellevue Lake late at night, searching aimlessly, like a desperate detective following long-gone clues. Finally, one rainy night, she found it, not through any brilliant means, but an almost instinctive guidance. She parked across the street from an apartment building called The Perch, a minimalist, glass and steel structure that stood discreetly on a quiet, tree-lined street. A silent statement of wealth and good taste, a name Isabelle hated for its pretentiousness, and even more so for the uniformed doorman who didn't even look at her Lexus. She turned off the engine and sat in her car, pretending to check her cell phone while her eyes drifted uncontrollably to the upper floors of the building. Based on Heather's description and her vague memories, Ethan's new digs were supposed to have a great view of the lake. She counted the floors, her gaze finally settling on a particular unit on the 8th floor, where a warm, soft light was on and the interior was vaguely visible through the gaps in the floor-to-ceiling windows and dark blue curtains. Then she saw silhouettes. Two of them. One of them, undoubtedly Ethan, broad-shouldered, hands in his pockets, pacing slowly around the living room, his usual stance when he was thinking about a problem. And the other, the woman, long hair elegantly coiled, even in the blur of light, her upright posture and the glass of wine in her hand were visible. Isabelle's heart felt like it was being clutched by an invisible hand. She saw the woman sidle slightly closer to Ethan, who was talking, and let out a light laugh as her head tilted back. The kind of laughter Isabelle hadn't heard in her own home in over a decade. A strong wave of nausea surged through her. It wasn't just because he had a new love, but because of the atmosphere that pervaded that room that was subdued, silent, and intimate without words. It wasn't fleeting passion or vindictive choices. It was something deeper, more solid, like a tree that quietly takes root when no one else does. That night, Ethan and Clara were discussing plans for an upcoming trip to the Montana mountains. Clara had recently finished a big project and needed to relax, and Ethan wanted to take the opportunity to get away from Seattle and cut ties with his past for good. "Are you sure you want to go that far away?" Clara asked as she took a light sip of her red wine. Ethan shrugged. "Why not? Fresh air, breathtaking scenery, and best of all, no one knows us. I can start over and be my true self." Clara smiled, a little mischievously. "Your true self? What does that look like?" "A mountain man, with a big beard and a plaid shirt." Ethan bursts out laughing, the most relaxed he's laughed in recent months. "Maybe. Who knows? I've gotten so used to 15 years of acting that maybe I've forgotten myself what the real me looks like." Just then, Ethan suddenly got the feeling that he was being watched. He turned his head to look out the window, but he couldn't see anything in the darkness of the night. But the feeling of being watched was so strong that he couldn't help but walk over and pull the curtains closed. "What's wrong?" Clara noticed his abnormality. Ethan shook his head. "Nothing. Maybe I'm just being sensitive." But deep down, he knew that Isabelle would find this place sooner or later. It was only a matter of time. Isabelle found herself leaning forward, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that her knuckles were white from exertion and she could only breathe sharply through her nose. She was staring deathly at that window. Who was that woman? Who the hell was she? That glass of wine, that posture, that aura of not needing to occupy space but naturally owning it. She was by no means some young office assistant or one of those simple-minded yoga instructors at the gym. This woman, with her experience and precipitation, has a certainty that Isabelle has never really possessed. She subconsciously adjusted the rearview mirror, which reflected her own face, tired eyes, makeup somewhat blown out from a day of running around, faded lipstick, newly grown roots that didn't fit in with the carefully picked-out color of her hair, and the wrinkles in her once stiff shirt that had been strangled by the seatbelt. A harsh, clear realization pierced her pride like a cold dagger. She, Isabelle, was no longer the kind of woman Ethan would choose. At least, She seemed so dim in front of that elegant figure. She sat in the car for nearly 20 minutes, like a voyeur, watching the shadows swaying in the glowing window. Watched Ethan pour the woman a drink, pull out a chair, and laugh again. Not once since the beginning had he glanced toward the window. He didn't know she was here. And to add to her despair, she could sense that even if he did know, he wouldn't care. Over the past few weeks, Ethan and Clara's relationship had been a delicate balance between openness and secrecy. They didn't intentionally hide it, but they also didn't want the relationship to be the talk of the town after dinner, especially when the divorce was still in process. This carefulness, however, became another form of humiliation in Isabelle's eyes, as Ethan not only found a new partner quickly, but did so with such grace and without any intention of showing off or retaliating, as if it was all a perfectly natural progression. This was more damaging than any public flaunting, for it sends the message that his happiness is not her concern and is not even worth using to show off or retaliate against her. He had truly and completely moved on. Isabelle held strong for 3 days. For 3 days, she lost sleep at night, her cell phone clutched tightly in her hand, pretending she didn't care, but unable to stop herself from clicking on that long silent dialogue box again and again in the wee hours of the morning. She frantically searched the floor plans of the perch, guessing which unit had a lake view and imagining the furnishings. For 3 days, she tried to maintain her carefully constructed order of life: Pilates, skin treatments, business lunches, and social dinners. But the dead silence, like a rubber band pulling tighter and tighter, threatened to snap at the edge of her sanity. Eventually, at a moment close to midnight, she gave in. Wrapped tightly in her robe, the glass of Chardonnay that had long since lost its chilling effect in her hand, she clicked on the old chat with Ethan that she still had on top. Fingers trembling, she typed in a line. "Isabelle, Ethan, can we talk?" She stared at the screen and read the lines 6 times, deleting the question mark and adding it back. The moment she pressed send, her heart nearly jumped into her throat. The minutes ticked by. Isabelle almost gave up and decided that he wouldn't reply. Just then, the screen lit up and a new message popped up. "Ethan, what else is there to talk about?" No punctuation, no warmth, just flat, cold, unquestioning rejection. Isabelle stared at the line, feeling like her chest had been filled with cement, so heavy she couldn't breathe. She read it again, hoping to pick up even the slightest flicker of emotion between the lines, but there was none. The words just lay there, quietly. What else is there to talk about? It wasn't mean or vindictive, which was what made her despair the most. It was utter indifference. She had been prepared for his anger, his taunts, even his accusations, but what she got was this sterile surgical cut. It made her feel like she was screaming in a vacuum. All her emotions lost their point of focus, unable to rebound or be utilized. She didn't reply. Any reply would only seem more pathetic. She swiped up the screen and looked at 15 years of their chats, the daily routines, the travel plans, the grocery store shopping lists, the late-night jokes, and "I love yous," all culminating in the cold closing line. What's there to talk about? For the first time, she realized with such clarity that their conversation had ended long before the divorce. Ethan had stopped talking, but she had been filling in the gaps with her own voice and fooling herself into thinking it was a two-way exchange. She had her cell phone screen face down over her pillow, but the faint glow still stubbornly penetrated the fabric. Isabelle lay in the darkness, breathing weakly, eyes rounded. Outside the window, somewhere across the lake, the window still lit up with a warm glow, but that glow no longer belonged to her. Ethan put his cell phone down and took a deep breath. He knew Isabelle would contact him. He just didn't expect it to be this soon. Clara came out of the bedroom, wearing a robe, her hair still a little wet. "What's wrong? You look a little nervous." He held up his cell phone. Isabelle messaged and said she wants to talk. Clara approached and sat next to him, but didn't bother to look at his phone screen. It was her usual style, respecting his privacy, even in moments like this. "Did you reply?" Ethan nodded. "I asked her what else she had to talk about." Clara is silent for a moment and asks softly, "Are you sure that's the way you want to respond?" The question made Ethan stop and think. He remembers the original purpose of his plan, not to hurt Isabelle, but to free himself completely. Excessive indifference and deliberate hurt would only lead him into another form of entanglement. "You're right," he said finally. Maybe I should be more. Not for me, Clara interrupted. For yourself. You need to really let go, not use apathy as another way to connect. Ethan looked at Clara and felt a wave of warmth flood through him. That's what he admired about her. She always looked at things so penetratingly, always seeing blind spots he hadn't even noticed himself. I'll reconsider how to respond to her, Ethan said. Maybe simply state that we have nothing more to talk about rather than ending with a question. Clara laughed. That sounds more like a real end than an invitation for her to continue the conversation. Just then, Ethan's cell phone screen lit up, showing another message from Isabelle. Isabelle, I was just wondering how you were doing. Ethan and Clara looked at each other, both knowing this was a test run, an attempt to reopen the conversation. Are you going to reply? Clara asked. Ethan shook his head. No. That's what I'm trying to avoid, being pulled back into that endless emotional tug of war. The best response is no response. He put his cell phone on silent and set it aside, then took Clara's hand. Come on, we have a Montana trip to plan. In this moment, Ethan realizes that the most important part of his revenge plan has been accomplished, not making Isabelle feel pain, but allowing himself to be truly free. He's chosen to move on and choose new happiness instead of dwelling on the past. That's the most powerful comeback of all. As the rain continued to fall, a long, quiet Seattle rain that seemed to wash away all the secret regrets of the heart, Isabelle sat in her car at the bottom of the perch and let the engine idle for 11 minutes. The windshield wipers swung from side to side in a slow, anxious rhythm. She wore no makeup, her hair pulled back in a loose bun, and she looked tired and frazzled in the same cashmere sweater from yesterday. There was no more of the elaborate armor of old, no carefully prepared speech, just impulsiveness and a desperate desperation bordering on desperation. She told herself it was no big deal, just a way to talk, to get things straight, and maybe salvage something. Though she didn't even believe in that maybe. As she rushed into the shiny, brightly lit lobby of the apartment building, drenched in rain, she realized that she hadn't even thought about what she was going to say to Ethan when she saw him. The concierge in the lobby didn't even raise her eyes, just politely inquired, "Hello, who may I speak to?" "Rebecca Alden," she announced her name, a hint of challenge in her voice that she hadn't even noticed, as if expecting the other person to recognize her or at least show a little surprise. "I'm here to see Ethan Alden." There was a short silence, but it was as long as a century. It was a polite pause, but enough to freeze the air. The concierge looked down and tapped a few keys on his computer. "I'm sorry, Mr. Alden has no registered visitors tonight. I'm his wife," Isabelle blurted out, her voice a little sharp. The man finally looked up, his gaze sweeping over her wet hair and slightly flustered face. His expression remained professionally calm, but Isabelle caught a flicker of something deep in his eyes, not a judgment, but an almost knowing recognition, the kind of subtle look that passes over you when you realize you're looking at someone who has lost everything. "Okay, I'll connect you." Another breathless wait, and Isabelle could imagine the look on Ethan's face when he saw her name flashing on the screen of the internal communications system in his minimalist living room, perhaps barefoot and holding a glass of expensive single malt scotch. She imagined him exhaling slowly, as if weighing something intangible, and then saying in his usual, emotionless voice, "Send her up." "You may go up," the concierge's voice interrupted her thoughts. "Elevator 3, top floor." The heart slammed against her ribs. The elevator's ascent felt much longer than it actually was. The car was silent. The only sounds were the rain pounding on the glass windows and the blurred lights of Bellevue outside the window. She saw her own reflection on the polished metal wall, her hair wet against her face pale and her eyes terrified. In that moment, she even somewhat failed to recognize herself. The elevator doors slid open noiselessly, and in front of her was an aisle that looked more like an art gallery than a residential hallway. Warm wood finishes, soft recessed lighting, and a silence thick enough to absorb all sound. Ethan's apartment door was ajar. She pushed it open gently. The first thing that hit her was the smell. It wasn't Ethan's usual aftershave or the faint scent of motor oil that he often smelled, but a richer, warmer aroma of amber and sandalwood with a hint of red wine. Low jazz music flowed in the background, and Chet Baker's voice was lazy and sexy, filling the space with just the right amount of white space. Then she saw him. Ethan had his back to the doorway, standing at the bar in the open kitchen, pouring red wine. He didn't look surprised or welcoming, just glanced sideways at her and said in a flat tone, "You're soaked." She stepped in, a little hesitant in her steps, unsure if she was welcome. "It's raining outside." Ethan handed her a towel. Not warm or cold, just a dry towel. The simple, almost indifferent gesture crushed her more than any heckling ever could. As she looked around, the apartment was just as she had imagined, if not better. Understated luxury, every item just right, not an ounce of unnecessary clutter. Clean, organized, and calm, just like Ethan himself. There was clearly no place reserved for her in this space. She opened her mouth to say something, but her voice caught in her throat at the sight of the blurry reflection on the glass balcony door. The silhouette of a woman. She was sitting on the couch, just at the edge of her line of sight, her posture graceful, her legs folded, and what appeared to be a book in her hand. Isabelle stiffened. Ethan noticed her gaze without the slightest intention to panic or explain. "We were just getting ready to eat." His tone remained calm, not deliberately cold or showy, just stating a fact. Isabelle stood in the foyer, drenched, small, and wretched. In that moment, she realized with clarity every choice she had made in the past year and where they had ultimately led her. She clutched the towel in her hand as if it were driftwood that could save her life. Ethan turned away and resumed pouring the wine. For a moment, Isabelle saw something almost terrifying, peaceful in the calm side of his face. He had really, completely, let go. And she, uninvited, had intruded into a life that had long ago had no place for her. She took 2 steps forward and hesitantly stepped into the living room, unsure if she should continue this doomed and embarrassing confrontation, or if she should turn and flee immediately. The heels made a soft clacking sound on the polished floor, each one like a knock at her mistake. The living room was dimly lit, but that darkness was carefully designed, with warm spotlights outlining the furniture and amber shadows spreading out lazily. The low, wandering jazz was like a lover's whisper. Then she got a good look at the woman. She sat on the edge of the slate gray sofa, legs folded, poised with the grace of a ballerina at rest. The seemingly casual silk dress she wore did not have a single wrinkle, even as she sat, holding a crystal goblet containing a deep red liquid in one hand and gently resting her cheek in the other. She was turning her head and surveying Isabelle with a polite but detached curiosity. There was a delicacy and composure to her face that transcended her age, a confidence that needed no words that money couldn't pile on and yoga couldn't practice. Isabelle's stomach lurched, but her brain felt as if it had short-circuited, unable to immediately correspond this face with someone in her memory. A distant, fuzzy shadow flickered at the edge of her consciousness, but she could never catch it. Ethan walked over to the woman and sat down, his movements natural and fluid, as if he'd rehearsed them countless times. He didn't put his arm on her shoulder, nor did he need to. The intimacy between them existed in that just right distance, quiet, silent, long ago in their bones and blood. This wasn't a new romance, much less a substitute sought for revenge. It was real, something Isabelle had never really had. He handed the woman, not Isabelle, the freshly poured glass of red wine in his hand before he glanced at Isabelle, his tone flat and impassive. "I'm sorry, we've moved on." These 8 words, without hostility or mockery, were like an invisible wall, hard and cold, completely isolating Isabelle. She stood there awkwardly, at a loss for words, like an uninvited guest who had mistakenly intruded on someone else's dinner party. Isabelle opened her mouth, but couldn't make any sound. She was still trying to recognize the woman's face, trying to understand why a voice deep in her brain was screaming, "I know you," while every cell in her body screamed, "Get out of here." She felt her soaked clothes clinging to her body like an out-of-place costume. Her hair was disheveled at the corners of her forehead, and her mascara might have smudged. She looked like the past, an anachronistic ghost that had intruded on the present, a ghost that didn't even realize she was dead. She turned to Ethan, trying to catch something, even if it was sarcasm. "You move fast." Ethan took a sip of his wine without looking at her. "You're the one who decided fast." The woman raised an eyebrow in interest at the comment and looked at Isabelle with no malice in her eyes, just a little bit of what looked like curiosity when watching a play with an unexpected plot. Isabelle's throat burned like it was on fire. I, I thought we might be able to talk. Her voice trailed off, so weak against the other woman's powerful aura. Ethan set down his glass. I thought we'd already talked. His gaze was calm and unmoving. The day you handed me the divorce papers. Humiliation crawled up her neck like a vine, burning her ears. There was no accusation, no abuse, just this breathtaking, graceful calm. He wasn't punishing her. He'd long ago dismissed her from his world. The elegant woman looked at Ethan, then at Isabelle, then leaned slightly toward Ethan. Would you like me to step back for a moment? Isabelle's head snapped up, and the pieces of her memory instantly fit together. College, a raucous dorm party, a course taken together, an unpleasantness over some stupid boy that she had long since put behind her. A girl she laughed at behind her back for being unremarkable and trying too hard. A girl who quietly changed her major because she was ostracized by her. What's her name again? Margot? Morgan? No, it's Clara. Clara Prescott. Isabelle instantly remembered who she was. The girl she had so easily erased from her social circle so many years ago. Ethan didn't answer Clara's question, but his silence itself was the answer. Isabelle's past has returned to her life in a way she never expected. And this time, she was no longer the main character. She stood there like a vase that no one knew how to place, a shame to throw away and an eyesore to display. Her voice was thinner than expected, tinged with disbelief that even she hadn't fully digested. You have started a new life? The question seemed a little childish when asked, like a child who had bumped into someone opening an early Christmas present. Ethan didn't sigh or scoff, just turned his head slightly sideways, his brow stretching as if he were commenting on the weather. You're the one who decided quickly. He swished the red wine in his glass, and I respect your choice. There was no sharp edge to his voice, and that was what overwhelmed her the most. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He wasn't trying at all. The words were like textbook statements of fact, cold and objective. Clara, yes, she was now 100% sure that she was Clara, looked to Ethan with a hint of disbelief, then back to Isabelle with a look of the kind of polite curiosity one gets when they realize they've accidentally intruded on some complicated plot. Excuse me. Her voice was soft. Her eyes were genuinely confused. May I ask? And this is? Isabelle blinked, her mouth opening, but no sound could come out. Her name was like gravel stuck in her throat. Ethan didn't rush to answer. He took another sip of his wine and leaned back slightly, not even looking at Isabelle, just saying calmly, "This is Rebecca, my ex-wife." Clara's eyebrows raised gently, to a small degree. It wasn't shock, it wasn't judgmental, it was just a pure surprise, like learning that a certain guest wasn't on the invitation list and not expecting to meet him or her in person at the door. "Oh," she said softly, "I didn't know." Isabelle flinched. It wasn't what Clara said that hurt her, but the way she spoke, with just the right amount of grace and genuine detachment. It was as if her presence was just an unexpected hiccup in this quiet evening, a minor inconvenience that needed to be dealt with properly. The entire room seemed to swallow her. What did she expect when she arrived with a heart full of anxiety and unanswered questions? Expecting that he would argue? Would cry? Would pull her aside and tell her it had all been a mistake? Tell her he still thought of her on those sleepless nights? But he didn't. He was sleeping peacefully, eating normally, laughing happily, existing in a world without her. Worse, he was surrounded by this person who replaced her so easily, making those 15 years of marriage seem like a fictional dream. Isabelle's voice sounded again, with an imperceptible tremor, like a whisper. She doesn't know who I am. Ethan finally looked at her again, his expression still hard to decipher. It wasn't her fault. Those were the words. Not angry, not mean, just the pure truth. Isabelle backed away slowly, still clutching the long cold towel in her hand, as if it were the final proof that she had once belonged here. But she didn't belong here anymore. She was just a footnote, a plot twist that had long since been resolved. All she could do was watch as Ethan turned back to Clara and continued their interrupted dinner conversation, like turning a crease in the page of a book and reading on. She came hoping to stir something. Sadness, guilt, longing. But what she finally confirmed was the harshest of truths. She no longer mattered. Isabelle was frozen in the doorway, soaking wet and tiny, like a bad sweater, disintegrating thread by thread in a glow that no longer made room for her shadow. Clara had gone back down to her book, and Ethan had returned to his wine. The silence between them, so calm, so full of life, made Isabelle feel like she was watching a movie that had long ago removed her. Her voice cracked before she realized she was speaking. You, her throat caught. Have you ever truly loved me? The question was asked so softly it bordered on childlike innocence. Not a weapon, not a test, just a naked, unguarded uncertainty. As if the question could turn back time and stitch up wounds that had been torn long ago. Ethan didn't answer right away. He just looked at her, no cruelty in his eyes, no resentment, only memories. And that, more than anything, hurt her. He set down his glass, moving with the careful deliberation of one who treats something once cherished. Then, sitting up slightly straighter, one hand resting gently on his knee, he said in a low, clear voice, I loved. Very deeply. Every single day. Even in the hardest times. Even in those rooms where you longed to break free and I felt small. Isabelle blinked rapidly as something burning stung the corners of her eyes. Ethan's voice was a little softer as he continued. Until you stopped loving us. It was we. Not I or me and you. It was we. It was as if that marriage was a third life form in the room that needed to be fed, listened to, tended to. And she'd let it wither, watched it wither between her and Ethan, like a forgotten houseplant that she'd even complained he'd forgotten to care for. Isabelle opened her mouth, but she couldn't say anything to apologize or find any defense. What could she say? That she was busy? Say she hadn't realized? That she didn't realize that when she told him over and over again to stop thinking too much and grow up, she was actually pushing him away? There is no ready-made script for this situation. There was only a dull ache that came from a door that had been closed so long ago that she had never noticed it was locked. Ethan stood up, not to see her out the door, just to stretch and, perhaps, to give her a silent signal that the conversation was over. He didn't look angry, he just seemed. The dust settled. Clara didn't turn her head again. She just continued to read her book. The floor lamp next to her shed a soft golden glow over her pages and Ethan's shoulder, as if the universe was highlighting the really important parts of the story. Isabelle turned slowly, the towel still clutched in her hand like a forgotten apology. She walks toward the door, no one following or stopping her. Ethan's words echo behind her, not bitter, not accusatory, just a judgment that cannot be appealed. The hallway was colder than she remembered, or maybe it was just her own senses. Isabelle didn't look back and stepped out. Her feet numb in the heels, she regretted her choice beyond measure at the moment. Her fingertips lingered on the edge of the door for a moment, just a second, as if expecting the wood to soften, that moment to stretch out indefinitely, giving her a chance to step back. But no, behind her, the door made the softest click she had ever heard. It wasn't a slam or an indignant slam, just a complete and unquestionable closure. No footsteps followed, no voices calling her name. No last-minute confessions chasing her out. There was only the hum of the elevator running and the faint, fading sound of jazz trumpets in the walls. She pressed the down button, her heart beating wildly in a sick, irregular way. That's what happens when your body hasn't quite come to terms with what your mind has long since made clear. She didn't cry, not because she didn't want to, but because there was no more room inside for tears. That sadness had dried up and settled into something quieter. Shame, perhaps, or regret, or, simply, the hollow echoes of choices she'd made that she thought she'd always have time to make up for. Still subconsciously, with a remnant of hope, she glanced back as the elevator doors slid open. There was still nothing. Ethan hadn't moved. Why should he move? He'd left long before she showed up tonight. It was just the way he'd left, so quietly, so gracefully, without all the pyrotechnics and dramatic effects she was used to. No shouting. No arguing, just a slow, deliberate detachment. It's like watching the fog gradually lift from a lake, only to realize with hindsight that the lake has long since become calm. The elevator's descent was like an eternity. She saw her reflection again on the polished metal walls. Wet hair, makeup that might have been blown out, a face taut with exhaustion, the kind of weariness that no amount of skincare could hide. She looked nothing like the woman who had handed him the divorce papers 5 weeks earlier with a smug smile and a carefully prepared monologue about needing space. She looked like someone who had finally realized what space really meant. The downstairs lobby is empty. The concierge glanced up at her, said nothing, but nodded politely, as if silently closing a file folder. Outside, the rain hadn't stopped, and Isabelle stepped out into it, not even bothering to open the umbrella she was holding. And above her head, in one of the eighth-floor units, Ethan poured himself another glass of red wine, resumed his seat beside Clara, and let out a long, silent breath. It wasn't a triumphant gesture or a deliberate show, just a complete relaxation. He didn't check his cell phone or watch her back as she left through the glass window. He just, naturally, picked up the conversation they had just been interrupted from and continued talking. It was as if nothing had happened, as if no one had been there. "Where were we?" he asked, his voice much lighter. Clara placed her hand over his and smiled slightly. "The cabin in Montana." "Ah, yes," Ethan nodded. "We should bring that 2014 Pinot Noir and drink it while we watch the stars." Clara threw back her head and laughed, that honest, unabashed laughter filling the room. "You're the only one who would think about drinking wine in the wilderness. Most people would bring beer or whiskey." "I'm not most men," Ethan shrugged, a hint of mischief in his tone, "just as you're not most women." Clara's eyes softened at those words, and she leaned in slightly to drop a soft kiss on the corner of Ethan's mouth. "Finally," she whispered, "you've found this." They looked at each other and smiled, the kind of smile that contained an understanding of the past, a cherishing of the present, and an anticipation of the future. It was an emotion Ethan had never experienced in his marriage to Isabelle. No pretense, no pandering, just being true to himself. Outside the window, the rain has diminished to a fine drizzle, and the city lights reflect a soft halo through the water droplets. Isabelle's figure has long since disappeared at the end of the street, while Ethan and Clara, in this warm space, are planning the next part of their journey. This is Ethan's revenge, not to fill his wounds by hurting the other, but to find true happiness by healing himself. He lets Isabelle see for herself that her betrayal not only didn't destroy him, but allowed him to find a lifestyle and a partner more suited to him. This kind of revenge, there is no bloodshed, no hysterical rage, only a calm detachment and a happy rebuilding. It kills far more than any intense confrontation. The house feels noisier now, not because of the noise, but because of the vacancy. Ethan's steady footsteps no longer paced the halls. The slight cough that came from the other room late at night while he read disappeared. The place beside her in bed was no longer just a metaphor. It took on weight, shape, became a real, present void that pulled relentlessly at her nerves as she lay awake at night, staring at the ceiling expecting to find answers. Isabelle swiped aimlessly across the screen of her phone, the blue light reflecting her face in a tired, ghostly color. Thumbs mechanically swept over the dynamic. Netflix promotions she barely looked at, her friend's birthday cake and puppy pictures. Her hands were moving by instinct, but her brain was elsewhere, stuck in some looped clip, haunted by words she couldn't forget. "You're the one who decided fast. I respect your choice." She didn't know what she was looking for until she found it. It was an image sandwiched between a beach shot and a dimly lit photo of sushi, posted by someone she hadn't contacted in years in her circle of friends. Clara. That Clara Prescott. Her profile was simple, sophisticated, and elegant, as was she herself, a woman who never needed to make a scene to get attention. Then she saw the photo. Ethan and Clara sitting at an outdoor table in soft golden light, both with glasses of wine in their hands and easy, natural smiles on their faces. Not posed, not acted out, the kind of calm smile you couldn't plan for, but could only come from the heart. Ethan's hand was resting casually on Clara's, and Clara's nails were the same soft pink color as they had been in the apartment. Isabelle's breath hitched, because now, in the moment of seeing this photo, she remembered all the forgotten details. Clara Prescott. Junior year, study group for Professor Halpern's ethics seminar. Clara was smart, enthusiastic, and helpful. And at the time, she, Isabelle, intoxicated with the thrill of always being the center of attention in a crowd, gently dismantled Clara's self-confidence, spreading harmless rumors and flirting with the boy Clara obviously had a crush on. A few weeks later, Clara changed majors, changed dorms, and disappeared from her world. Isabelle never thought of her again. Until now. Until Clara reappeared in Ethan's life like a silent, belated reckoning. Isabelle clicked on the photo. The text underneath was simple, almost like a whisper. Sometimes happiness starts exactly where despair ends. There were no hashtags, no emoticons, just the calm, undeniable truth. Isabelle stares at the screen until her eyes glaze over and burn. Then she snapped the phone screen face down on the nightstand. She didn't cry, not because she wasn't heartbroken, but because even her grief felt like it came too late. Grief belonged to those things that might still be redeemable, and what she felt now was something colder, more final. The house creaked around her as if it too was remembering the man's presence. Every room, every wall, seemed to still bear the fingerprints of the man she had mistaken for eternity. And now he was someone else's future. The future of the one who remembered him as good, who forgave him for his faults, who knew how to love him before it was too late. Isabelle slumped backward onto the bed, feeling so clearly for the first time how small she was in this big bed. Not physically, but in an existential sense. It was as if the world had continued to run for a long time without her noticing, and all that was left for her was the void created by the moment she had chosen to stop loving in the first place. The rain pattered outside her window, and her cell phone screen went dark. Isabelle knew that tomorrow the sun would rise as usual and people would go on with their lives. But for her, something was over forever. Not because of Ethan's revenge, but because she finally saw the consequences of her choices. She had thought that divorce would give her freedom and happiness, but now she realizes that true freedom is taking responsibility for one's actions, and true happiness comes from honestly giving, not constantly taking. This revelation comes too late. Ethan is gone, truly and completely. He took with him not only his belongings, but the love and trust that had existed. And those were the things she could never get back. For the first time since this fiasco began, she truly understood what she had lost, not only Ethan, but the past version of herself that perhaps once deserved to be loved. That's the end of today's story. For more captivating tales, hit subscribe and never miss an episode.